Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Assassination of Julius Caesar, the Ides of March 44 BCE by Historia Civilis. So we are coming to the end of a pretty long journey we've been on together, and that journey is the story of Julius Caesar. The next episode after this is Caesar's funeral, and at that point we will truly be done with that journey. Now, we've got more Historia Civilis videos to react after this one, and I will continue to react to all of them, but this is a pretty monumental moment. I mean, we've been following Caesar throughout basically his entire career. We've seen the ups and downs, his successes, his losses, and now we're finally coming to the end of his life. I'm very excited to end this journey, though a little bit sad that we are finally bringing it to an end. If you guys enjoy this video, I would appreciate it. If you want to see extra, exclusive reaction content, please check out the Patreon, which is linked in the description, or become a channel member by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar began with a meeting between three men, Cassius Longinus, Marcus Brutus, and Decimus Brutus.
Oh man. Brutus, we've already seen him before, and he will become a main character in this saga.
Cassius was an experienced soldier and general. A decade earlier, he had fought the Parthians under Crassus. After Crassus's humiliating defeat, Cassius rallied the survivors and successfully defended Syria against a Parthian counterattack. He would go on to command a Pompeian fleet during the Civil War, and to everyone's surprise, he proved himself to be Rome's most successful naval commander in a generation. Not that it made much of a difference, because as we know, Pompey was eventually defeated, and Cassius was captured. But Caesar recognized talent when he saw it. He issued Cassius a full and complete pardon, and put him in charge of one of his legions destined for Egypt.
And this is what I said a couple episodes earlier. I know Caesar has been making some mistakes lately. He has been blatantly trying to make himself a king, basically. Just all these authoritarian power grabs. There's a lot of bad about Caesar, and we've been seeing a lot of those bad elements. But what I said a couple episodes ago is that he wasn't one to hold grudges past their due date. He was a man who recognized talent. And he was a man who knew when it was more valuable to have someone on your side than against you. Now, over the last couple of episodes, I think Caesar has managed to alienate a lot of those people who could have been on his side. But this is still sort of highlighting one of Caesar's positive qualities, which is that, he was merciful when he needed to be. And that had worked for him. Now, things are sort of shifting in the other direction, of course.
The Alexandrian campaign turned out to be kind of a disaster, but thanks in part to Cassius's leadership, the Romans were able to hold their own until reinforcements arrived. After Egypt, Cassius let Caesar know that he would not participate in the slaughter of Pompeians, and so Caesar sent him back to Rome.
I mean, I respect that. That is standing by your principles, at least to a certain extent.
Cassius paid a professional price for his loyalty, because when it came to the upcoming Parthian campaign, Caesar planned to stick Cassius in a thankless administrative job in Syria.
I love the music we have going on, by the way. I mean, Historia Civilis is just fantastic at really setting the scene, and he's gotten better and better over time, and his music selection is always excellent. Just a quick note on the production of these videos.
We've talked about Marcus Brutus before. There's not that much to say of his early political career beyond the fact that he aligned himself with the ultra-conservative Cato. Unlike Cassius, Brutus was not a military man. During the Civil War, he joined up with the Pompeians, but as far as we can tell, he didn't really do anything. After Pompey's defeat, he immediately surrendered to Caesar, who in turn gave him the fairly important job of governing Cisalpine Gaul.
We saw that Brutus had sort of a personal relationship with Caesar, so his situation, his relationship with the man is sort of complicated. And Brutus is someone who will become very, very famous in our history. And I honestly think, I mean, there's two sides. Of course, he's very prominent in the history of the event. He's a really important character. But I think a lot of this has been popularized by the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. A lot of these characters and this story has really been popularized over the last couple hundred years in sort of Western culture. And I guess global culture. Shakespeare's had a global influence in many ways.
Promising to fast-track him all the way up to consul in the years to come. You see, through all of this, Brutus maintained a fairly good personal relationship with Caesar.
Right.
Brutus's mother Servilia had been in a romantic relationship with Caesar for about 20 years. This was not seen as unusual. Servilia was an older woman, twice widowed, plenty of children. She was free to see whoever she wished. Because of this relationship, Brutus had known Caesar for his entire adult life, if not longer. Caesar was happy to help out his mistress's son however he could.
Yes, Caesar was in some ways maybe not a father figure, but sort of a mentor figure to Brutus. An elder who, I mean, not that he was super old, but an elder man who could help him career-wise and who could probably give him advice. So they had a pretty decent relationship.
Decimus Brutus, distant cousin, had a different story to tell. Decimus was an honest-to-God, dyed-in-the-wool Caesarian. He had spent at least 5 years serving under Caesar in Gaul. He even fought alongside Caesar and Antony at the Battle of Alesia. You might even say that...
And that was one of the battles that really gave Mark Antony his name, really rose him through the ranks and got him Caesar's attention. Not to mention it was just an important battle in general, which we saw when we reacted to it.
He was in Caesar's inner circle. During the Civil War, Decimus stayed behind in Cisalpine Gaul, where he impressed everybody by putting down a pretty bad uprising. After this, Decimus got the nod from Caesar and was elected praetor. Next year, he would be heading off to Cisalpine Gaul once more, this time as its formal governor.
I'm curious to see how Decimus turns against Caesar. I mean, we've got, a Pompeian who fought against the Parthians, then sort of joined up with Caesar. Brutus, who has sort of a complicated relationship, but a pretty good personal relationship with Caesar. And Decimus, who was a supporter of Caesar. And all these people are coming together to plan his assassination. Quite a group.
Each of these three men, Cassius, Brutus, and Decimus, came to believe that Caesar intended to destroy Roman politics.
Though, I guess on a quick note, a lot of the most hardcore Pompeians were killed in the Civil War. I mean, many Pompeians are still around, but those like Cato, who needed to oppose Caesar at every level, well, they've already been killed or committed suicide. They're dead, basically. They're gone. And so a lot of those left who would resist Caesar are maybe more moderate Pompeians, or those who joined up with Caesar, or, whatever it may be.
By crowning himself king. In fact, this was already happening before their eyes. Caesar wielded most of the powers of a king already, and Roman politics were becoming more and more irrelevant by the day.
We saw that last time.
The only way out of this mess was to remove Caesar from the equation. He had to die.
And how wrong they were. I mean, obviously they never, ever could have known what would happen after they assassinated Caesar. I don't think it was unfair to have the belief that, well, maybe if we get rid of Caesar, we can sort of return to the Republic. I mean, I think it was, even at the time, a bit naive. The Republic was already crumbling before Caesar, but they never could have known that, this event, not necessarily that it would lead to, but following the assassination of Caesar, we would have hundreds and hundreds of years of top-down authoritarian rule. I mean, that was probably not the intended outcome.
But in order to get a shot at this, first, their little conspiracy had to expand, and it didn't take very long to get some top-tier politicians on board.
I'm
People
sure.
like Gaius Trebonius, a former consul, general, and veteran of the Gallic Wars, who had recently become disillusioned with Caesar over his treatment of the Senate. People like Tillius Cimber, a preacher and former Caesarian who saw this conspiracy as his ticket to power. People like Publius Servilius Casca, a childhood friend of Caesar's, now a tribune of the plebs, who had since become so alarmed at Caesar's authoritarianism that he signed on to this conspiracy to end his life.
I mean, it's really remarkable how many of these people were once Caesarians. They once supported Caesar or were friends of his, knew him personally. But like we talked about, a lot of the most diehard Pompeians are already gone. And so those left were probably more moderate or even supporters of Caesar at some point. And this also shows you that even supporters of Caesar have been alienated by his blatant authoritarian power grabs, which we saw a lot of in the last video.
In the end, 60 senators joined the conspiracy, which
Whoa.
you could argue is too many people. Roughly 7% of the entire Senate. Way too many to keep a secret.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of people. And this is the faction of the Senate that wanted to fight back. You know, I've been pretty harsh on the Senate so far. You know, I've repeatedly talked about how the Senate became an institution that was just, you know, bowing to the authority above it, hoping that it can maintain some of its privilege. And that's absolutely true. But here we see that percentage of the Senate who isn't satisfied with that. You know, they want to do a little more than just satisfying the guy at the top. You know, they want to have their own power back. And I'm sure a lot of the people involved in this plot were involved for many different reasons. But at the very least, they all wanted to fight back for one reason or another.
The 60 conspirators began to meet regularly to strategize their next moves. The majority argued that the logical next step was to bring Mark Antony on board. He was Caesar's consular colleague for that year. If he signed off on the assassination, perhaps that would pacify Caesar's legions. Plus, the conspirators believed that they had a lot to offer Antony. After Caesar was gone, if Antony could bridge the divide between Caesar's veterans and the conspirators, he would become one of the most powerful senators in Rome.
I'm curious to see if they can get Mark Antony on board, because as we know, he performed badly earlier on, and he was sort of chastised and pushed out of Rome by Caesar, but recently they had a bit of a reconciliation. So Mark Antony's back into the fold, and he's back on Caesar's side. So I'm curious if Mark Antony would turn against him. Also, I mean, in doing this, you do also risk making Mark Antony into some sort of authoritarian ruler, like Caesar has been. I mean, he's shown in the past that he's certainly willing to take any power he wants.
A consensus was forming, but before any definitive action could be planned, the former consul Trebonius spoke up. He knew Antony well, as they had both served under Caesar in Gaul. He revealed to the group that just last year, he had personally approached Antony as part of another conspiracy, and that Antony had flatly turned him down. When Trebonius revealed this rejection to the old conspiracy, people got spooked, and the whole thing fell apart. Why risk tipping their hand, Trebonius argued, when they already knew Antony's answer?
It's a good point.
The conspirators were convinced. Fine, no Antony. But what about Cicero? He was one of the few remaining former consuls who predated Caesar's rise to power.
Yes, Cicero is a very interesting figure who I would love to learn more about, by the way. You know, he's a man who, independent base of support, absolutely. He always does his own thing. Now, he's definitely more of a conservative. He's like a moderate conservative. You can group him in with that faction. But Cicero is someone who always did what he wanted to do, right? He always went his own way. And so he's someone who was willing to work with the Caesarians and the Pompeians in a time where there was, you know, remarkable polarization. Someone like Cato would refuse to make almost any deal with the Caesarians and wanted to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. Cicero is more willing to compromise. So if you can get Cicero on your side, that's a pretty popular, influential, and at least someone who's seen as independent, individual who you can get to support you. So that would be pretty valuable.
He was the guy who put down the Catiline Rebellion 20 years earlier. A hero, an elder statesman. Maybe he was the one to lead them out of this mess. After some debate, the conspirators ultimately decided against inviting Cicero into the conspiracy. We don't 100% know why, but one reason may be that in an effort to influence the new regime, Cicero had been spending an unhealthy amount of time with Caesarians. Some conspirators may have feared that he had gone over to the other side.
Yeah, I'm not sure what would have happened if they brought Cicero in. I think I could see him going either way. I mean, you could imagine him supporting the plot, you could imagine him staying out of it, and you could imagine him alerting the Caesarians. It just depends on whatever he thought was best for, himself and for Rome as a whole. So I really don't know. I think Cicero would be a toss-up. You wouldn't really know what he would do.
Another unusual aspect of this conspiracy, which may be pertinent here, is that it reflected a strong generational divide. For whatever reason, the conspiracy consisted almost entirely of men in their early 40s. Maybe these people just knew each other the best, or maybe they had the most to gain in a power vacuum, who knows? Cicero was well into his 60s.
I don't know, that's an interesting thing because the older you are at this point, the more you remember the old days of the Republic. So you would think that, maybe these older people would be the ones who would want to defeat Caesar and return to the old days. But no, this is a group of, in terms of politics, a relatively young group of men. So maybe it's just that some of the older people were just worn out by the years of constant warfare. Maybe the younger guys had a little more energy, or maybe, all they had known was constant warfare, and so they were ready to keep fighting. I don't really know. I think it could have been a lot of things. Maybe some of you have some insight on why the group was composed of this certain age of man.
And quite simply, nobody in the conspiracy knew him that well. So Cicero had been fraternizing with the Caesarians, and nobody in the conspiracy could vouch for him. Fine, Cicero was out. The conspiracy would have to move ahead in its current form.
It could also be that a lot of those older politicians have been bumped off. If they sided with the Pompeians, they may not either be influential anymore, or they may not be alive anymore. So it could be that as well.
One decision that the conspirators came to pretty early on was that the assassination should occur in public. This had to be seen by the people as a legitimate act, full of idealism and conviction. No back alley murders.
Okay. I think I agree with that, but to make it legitimate will take more than that. We have to keep that in mind.
Beyond this vague statement of principle, there was very little agreement as to how they should actually proceed.
Yeah.
Some people threw around the idea of assassinating Caesar while he was overseeing that year's elections. In a situation like that, Caesar would be up on a raised platform, in full view of the electorate. That certainly met the criteria of being public. But how exactly were they supposed to pull this off? Caesar would be up in an exclusive VIP area surrounded by supporters. And even if they could pull it off, an assassination before the entire electorate had a 100% chance of causing a riot. The conspirators might not survive.
Yeah.
Others considered killing him on the way to the elections. If they could predict his route ahead of time, they could set up an ambush as he was crossing a bridge. Caesar would have bodyguards. There would be a tussle, but some of the conspirators believed that if they moved quickly, they might be able to rush Caesar and push him off the side of the bridge.
Well, we're far past the era when it was inappropriate to bring weapons or bodyguards within the bounds of the Pomerium. Roman politics at this point is extremely militarized. We see politicians using mob violence, bodyguards, all that kind of stuff, and we've been seeing that for years at this point. So, you know, there's going to be a tussle either way. I mean, if you'd done this decades and decades ago, a political assassination would have been a lot easier. But decades and decades ago, it would have been far more unthinkable than it is at this point. So once again, we're just seeing how far we've come from an era of relatively stable Republican politics through this era of chaos into basically authoritarian rule where violence is still relatively permissible.
This probably wouldn't kill him, but they could have assassins waiting below to finish the job.
River plan? Yeah, you know, it's a risky one. If you're not certain that you'll be able to murder the guy, that's always a risky assassination plan. I mean, there's always a risk that something is going to happen that you don't expect, but in a plan like that, there's a lot of different variables. Caesar will be protected, perhaps he could escape off the bridge, maybe he can jump over the side, get away, maybe you won't catch him, so that seems like a very volatile plan.
This was a better plan, but it was extremely complicated, and a big part of it relied on the physical prowess of a bunch of nerdy-ass senators.
Yeah,
they then
I don't know about
toyed
that.
with yet another plan. As a side business, Decimus happened to run a company of gladiators. The conspirators discussed using these gladiators to somehow attack Caesar at some public games. You know, leave the killing to the professionals. So they had 3 plans on the table: the election plan, the bridge plan, and the gladiator plan.
I feel like none of these are great plans. There's sort of flaws with each.
Conspirators went back and forth for meeting after meeting after meeting, debating pros and cons.
I mean, we didn't really touch on the gladiator plan. I think the negative with that is that they made pretty clear they wanted the assassination to be, you know, a show of their political principles. And I think using hired gladiators to do the assassination sort of takes away a little bit from the ideological part of the assassination. It would definitely be more powerful if they themselves were to do it.
Each scenario introduced a dangerous amount of uncertainty into the equation, and the group struggled to come up with any sort of consensus. This is one of the downsides of having 60 people in the conspiracy.
Yeah, that is a big conspiracy. That's a big assassination plan. When I think about this sort of conspiracy, you're usually talking, you know, maybe like 5 to 15. That's more an appropriately small-sized group. This is a lot of damn people.
Last time 60 people agreed upon anything. But then, out of nowhere, Caesar publicly announced what up until now had been a closely held secret. He would be leaving Rome on March 18th.
Yeah.
The conspirators had been operating under the assumption that they would have months to figure out a plan. They were wrong. They had weeks. This changed everything. All of the old plans were thrown away, and the conspirators started again from scratch. They still agreed that the assassination needed to happen in a public place, but after debating the old plans, they now knew that it also needed to happen in a controlled environment, preferably away from bodyguards and potential rioters.
Yeah.
On top of all that, this new time constraint meant that they had to throw the whole thing together quickly. It couldn't be too elaborate.
Look, I think when we have a situation like this, where you're planning some sort of assassination or revolt or revolution, putting a time pressure on it can often make it fall apart. I mean, we can look at the Decembrists in the case of Russia in the early 1800s. They were put into a situation where they were given the opportunity to immediately revolt. They were not ready. It fell apart. But, you know, a lot of revolutions, assassinations are, you know, fairly spontaneous, whether they actually happen on the spot or it takes a pretty short period of planning. So this can also be a way to actually force you to go through with it. Because when you have stuff like this, these sort of assassination plans, they frequently do not actually happen, or something goes wrong, or they fall apart. I mean, we mostly hear about the plots that succeed, but for every plot we hear about in history that manages to kill someone super important, there are probably like 10, 20, whatever, that absolutely fail and fall apart. So, you know, there's pros and cons for having this sort of rapid time pressure.
Senate meetings happened all the time. A Senate meeting wouldn't require any additional prep work. It also had the virtue of still technically being a public place, while at the same time being nice and isolated. Caesar's bodyguards would not be allowed inside. And then there was the whole symbolic thing, removing a tyrant during a Senate meeting. This was perfect. Finally, the conspirators agreed on something. Now all they had to do was figure out the particulars. Caesar would be leaving on March 18th, so they agreed that their attack should take place during the last Senate meeting before his departure. That would be on March 15th.
Whoa, they are not leaving much wiggle room, huh? 15th, and then if something goes wrong or it doesn't happen, you have 2 days to get him before he leaves. So, once again, they're on the clock.
The Ides of March. But coordinating this wasn't as simple as you might think. Caesar was personally financing a complete redesign of Rome's downtown area, which included Rome's old Senate house. Because of this, the Senate had been randomly meeting in various temples scattered throughout the city. The conspirators agreed that the safest thing to do would be to stash some weapons on location, but because of all this bouncing around, they couldn't be 100% certain where this particular Senate meeting would be taking place. So instead, they decided that a select group of senators needed to hide daggers in their togas.
Whoa.
This would be dangerous, as it was a death penalty offense to carry a dagger inside the pomerium, but it had to be done.
Right. I mean, it is definitely dangerous for senators themselves to be carrying weapons, though with the idea that it's a death sentence to carry a dagger within the pomerium, I mean, come on. We've already talked about how violent and militant Roman society has become. There have been many, many people carrying weapons within the pomerium in the last couple of years. So, to what extent that's enforced, I don't really know. But, for a senator themselves to be armed and not just have, like, guards, yeah, that is definitely sort of a step above what is normal.
For everybody else, they decided to smuggle weapons into the Senate meeting using these baskets that were always full of note-taking materials.
Jeez.
If the location of the meeting was changed at the last minute, these baskets would hopefully come with them.
And this, I mean, like a lot of assassination plans, but this is a really dangerous and risky plan. I mean, all it really takes is for one of these baskets to be uncovered or for someone to be caught with a weapon on them, and then suspicions are raised.
Late in this process, Cassius brought up something that had been troubling him. What about Antony? Caesar and Antony were co-consuls for that year, and if this thing was going down during a Senate meeting, Antony would be only a few paces away. Knowing him, he'd probably put up a fight. Plus, if they were successful, Antony would be Rome's only remaining consul. What if he was angry? What if he came after them? Wouldn't it be much safer to just kill them both?
I mean, if you're in a situation where you assassinate Caesar, particularly if the public is angry with you, then Antony could absolutely wield his authority as Caesar's second-hand man to come after you guys and take over in his own right. I wonder what Lepidus is up to at this point, because Antony is sort of back into Caesar's good graces. He appears to be Caesar's second-in-command again, but Lepidus was filling that role for a while. So I wonder where he's at. He's another sort of influential Caesarian that you've got to keep an eye on. But Antony seems to be the main concern, aside from Caesar at this point. We also have Octavian, who, in retrospect, will also be one of the main concerns in the long term.
Cassius then went one step further. So long as they're having this conversation, what about Lepidus? He wasn't a consul or anything, but he was sitting on Tiber Island, just outside of Rome's pomerium, with a full legion.
I didn't even have to ask. He was going to bring it up right afterwards. So that's what Lepidus is doing. And he's got a full legion. So he also represents a pretty significant threat.
If Antony declared a state of emergency or something, he might ask Lepidus to cross the pomerium and restore order.
The question is, after you assassinate Caesar, what happens, right? Does the Caesarian faction fall apart and the public is happy that Caesar has been assassinated? If so, you have less to worry about. But if the general consensus is, angry at the conspirators and the Caesarian faction manages to stick together, then you might have gotten rid of Caesar, but his faction is still there and it's still in control, right? This is what you have to worry about.
This would be a disaster. Cassius continued. If, on the other hand, they took out Caesar, they took out Antony, they took out Lepidus, they took control of that legion, they would probably be able to pressure the Senate into endorsing the assassinations retroactively.
Yeah, so, if your plan is to retake control of Roman politics, then that is absolutely a more complete plan. But that is also an incredibly complicated plan. 3 assassinations plus the seizure of a legion? How are you going to do that, huh?
Brutus strongly disagreed. They were not revolutionaries. They were not here to overthrow the government.
Okay, and this is where you're going to get into disagreements. So, what is your plan? Are you just here to assassinate Caesar and keep the status quo? I would say that's sort of naive, to be honest, because if you assassinate Caesar, you're going to fall into chaos anyway. Are you going to let the Caesarian faction take over? If your whole plan is to return to old Republican values, then you're going to have to do more than assassinate Caesar. But of course, some of these conspirators don't want to do that, people like Brutus. But are you somebody, another one of these conspirators, like Cassius, who wants to do more, who actually wants to enforce their Republican ideals, who wants to retake the government? If so, then yeah, you do see yourself as a revolutionary who's going to completely overthrow the government. But these are very different ideas of what exactly you want to do.
In fact, that's exactly what they were trying to prevent. What they had all agreed to do was remove a tyrant.
Right, and I do see that, but once again, there's more than just Caesar at play here. Now, yeah, removing Caesar could definitely get rid of all this authoritarian leadership and cripple the Caesarian faction, but if there's people like Lepidus and Mark Antony still around, you risk them taking over again.
What Cassius was talking about was a purge. This argument escalated, and eventually it split the conspirators along partisan lines. The former Pompeians sided with Cassius, and the former Caesarians sided with Brutus.
This is making a lot of sense now. So, once again, we're getting back down to Pompeians and Caesarians. We talked a little bit about it at the beginning of this episode, and it's coming up again. You have the ex-Caesarians. Seems like perhaps Brutus is their speaker, their leader, maybe. These are people who are somewhat ingratiated with the Caesarians. They might know Caesar. They might know a lot of his supporters. And they don't oppose the Caesarian faction. They just oppose what Caesar is doing in particular. And so all they want to do is get rid of Caesar. Versus the Pompeians, some of whom, at this point, I would imagine they're probably holding on to Republican principles because Pompey was a bit of an authoritarian himself, but he is long, long gone. So these are people who completely oppose the Caesarian faction. They don't want to just get rid of Caesar, they want to get rid of the whole thing. And I would guess go back to an earlier era of Roman politics, reshape the political system. And, like I said, this division is starting to make a lot of sense now that we sort of see the partisan breakdown, but these are also very different goals.
After some high drama, Brutus finally turned the tide. He told the group that, like it or not, Caesar's reforms were popular. If they started down the road of purging Caesarians, they would inevitably end up repealing Caesarian legislation as well.
And I think he makes a good point. I did say I do think it's naive to just get rid of Caesar and expect everything to change, but if you're someone like Brutus, that's not what you want anyway, right? That is true. Caesar at this point might be losing some of his popularity because of all the authoritarian monarch-like stuff he's been doing. But a lot of the reforms and policies that Caesar has implemented are very popular, and you have to keep that in mind.
They wouldn't be able to help themselves. When that happened, Brutus said, the Roman people would turn on them.
Yeah.
It would forever politicize the assassination. A better path, he argued, was to surgically remove the rot at the heart of Roman politics. Once Caesar was gone, everything else got easier.
Yeah, and I very much understand what he's saying. That turned out not to be true at all. And I do think that is sort of a misunderstanding. Remove the rot from Roman politics, which to him means removing Caesar. Unfortunately, the rot in Roman politics has been around for years, right? It's not Caesar. Caesar is, in some ways, more of a symptom. You know, the rot is the corruption, the mob violence, all of the stuff that we've seen, and that is not just Caesar. That's many political figures. So, you know, while I understand this partisan breakdown, and it does make sense if you have that perspective, like Brutus does, but if you legitimately wanted to remove the rot from Roman politics and sort of reshape Roman politics, then you need to do a lot more than just get rid of Caesar.
This argument convinced Cassius and the ex-Pompeians. Fine, no purges, Caesar only. So what was Caesar doing while all of this was going on? Just going about his business, making preparations for the upcoming campaign. But he wasn't totally oblivious to the fact that something strange was going on. Around this time, the priest Spurina, who in my opinion probably had contacts inside the conspiracy,
Yeah, we heard about this.
began to warn Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Caesar was getting other clues as well, although in the
Spurina sort of framed this as some sort of prophecy or religious thing, when in reality, what Historia Civilis said at least, was that Spurina was probably either involved or had heard about the assassination plot, which is sort of a very funny way to present that to somebody. Like, you know about this plot, but you don't want to indict yourself or, you know, some of the people you know who are involved, who might be, like, your buddies. And so you come to Caesar and say, I've got this prophecy that, you know, you gotta watch out for the Ides of March. You could have been a little bit more direct if you really wanted to warn him.
moment he didn't quite know what to make of them. For instance, days before the Ides, he pulled Cassius aside for a quick meeting. When Cassius left, Caesar turned to one of his aides and said something like, "What's his problem? He looks sick." On the day before the Ides of March, Lepidus invited Caesar and Decimus to his home for dinner and drinks.
Dude, and it really shows you this is more of sort of a palace coup. A lot of these guys who were involved in this plot, not only are they like former supporters of Caesar, or they were friends with him once, but they know him now. They are friends with him at the moment of the assassination, or, you know, at least Caesar thinks they're friends, or they're allies, right? Shows you how close they all are, and they're planning to murder this guy. It's pretty crazy.
As one of the original three conspirators, Decimus had been careful to stay on good terms with the Caesarians, and apparently this strategy was paying off, because even at this late stage, he was still in Caesar's inner circle.
Jeez.
The three men ate and drank and chatted late into the night. Much of the conversation centered around the upcoming Dacian and Parthian wars.
I gotta say, I understand that, you know, those who are involved in this plot have bigger principles at stake, but, you know, to be someone like Decimus, who was willing to plot this assassination, yet still be on good terms with Caesar and the Caesarians, I feel like you do have to be pretty cold-blooded. Like, I don't know if I could sit down to a meal with the man, look him in the eyes, knowing that I plan to kill him, right? That's pretty dark. And like I said, if you truly believe in your principles and you believe what you're doing, I can understand how, you know, the ends justify the means. But I would feel, I think, really guilty doing something like that, or at least, you know, very bad about it. I don't know if I could personally handle that sort of interaction.
Caesar and Lepidus would be leaving in a few days, and Decimus would be leaving later in the year to go and take over as the governor of Cisalpine Gaul.
Wow.
This province would be key to keeping Caesar supplied in Dacia, and so the three men spoke of stockpiles and supply lines, and oh boy, it must have been riveting. As the night wore on and the drinking took its toll, the conversation turned philosophical. Somehow, somebody brought up this question: what's the best way to die?
Uh-oh.
Lepidus and Decimus went back and forth pontificating, and Caesar got uncharacteristically quiet. After a bit, he made up his mind and told the others that the best way to die would be suddenly and unexpected. When I imagine this incident, I imagine a half-drunk Decimus dying inside and trying to think of a way to change the subject.
Yeah, just imagine what was going through his head. I mean, even if there must have been some feelings of guilt or I don't know, but especially at that moment, he must have been incredibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading in.
But it was fine. Eventually, the evening wound down, and everybody went home. The next morning, Caesar awoke to the sound of screaming. It was still hours before dawn, and his wife Calpurnia was inconsolable. She told him that she had just experienced the most vivid dream of her life, where she witnessed the roof on their home collapse. In the last moments of the dream, the part where she was quite literally screaming, she saw herself covered in blood and holding Caesar's mangled corpse in her arms.
Now, I do wonder, with stories like this, to what extent did this actually happen, and to what extent was this an invention of later historians, or even contemporary Roman historians? I mean, they certainly like to make things interesting, to fictionalize a little bit. So, I'm not really sure what the sources are on a lot of this. This definitely could have happened, but it seems a little too perfect to be true, you know what I mean? So, it seems like it also could have been something that was perhaps invented after the fact. I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
After this, both husband and wife found it impossible to go back to sleep, so they got up and spent hours talking as they waited for dawn. The ancient sources take care to point out that Calpurnia was basically an atheist, and that she wasn't the kind of person who believed in prophetic dreams. By now, Calpurnia had definitely heard Spurinna's warnings to beware the Ides of March. Today was the Ides. Calpurnia's subconscious appeared to be playing out a version of the thing that she feared the most.
I was gonna say, okay, so that makes it a little more realistic. This could be something where, our subconscious acts in funny ways. This could have been her mind, psychologically, telling her, this is what she fears the most, this is what she's worried about, and so it gives her sort of a dream related to that. If she'd heard about these rumors, or, what Spurinna had told Caesar, yeah, this definitely could have happened. This could be true.
When the sun came up, Caesar complained to his wife that he was feeling sluggish and dizzy. Some historians have taken this to mean that Caesar may have had a seizure in his sleep, but with the drinking the night before, how could you possibly say?
Yeah, I mean, it could have just been the drinking, plus he's been up late at night for several hours, so it could very well just be that.
That morning, Caesar was scheduled to make an appearance at some minor religious ceremony in his capacity as Rome's chief priest. This thing would have taken place literally steps from Caesar's front door. Not a big time commitment. Caesar went to the ceremony and spotted Spurinna across the crowd. Caesar playfully called out to him, "The Ides of March have come." Spurinna responded mysteriously, "Yes, the Ides have come, but they have not yet gone."
Bro, Spurinna, if you're actually worried about Caesar, I wish you would have maybe given some more concrete warnings. I understand that, sure, prophecies and religious symbols and signals didn't mean a lot in Roman culture, but, I mean, I'm not saying I would or would not have wanted Caesar to be assassinated, but if you are trying to warn him and save him, I feel like you could have done a little more clear of a job.
When Caesar returned home, he complained to Calpurnia that he still wasn't feeling well. The two talked it over for a bit, and they eventually decided that since Caesar would be leaving on campaign in a few days, he should rest and recover while possible. The Senate was scheduled to meet that day, so Caesar sent word to Antony to go ahead and cancel the meeting on account.
And this is what happens with assassination plots. It only takes one little thing, and everything starts to fall apart.
Of him being sick. Caesar had just unknowingly upended the conspiracy. Like a flash, Decimus showed up at Caesar's home and asked him why he was canceling the meeting. Caesar told him about Calpurnia's dream and about how neither one of them had really gotten any sleep. Decimus laughed in Caesar's face, calling the whole thing superstitious nonsense.
Wow, okay, so hey, Decimus was definitely committed. I'm not sure if he was feeling those strong feelings of guilt I mentioned earlier. He's willing to go directly to Caesar and be like, hey man, what's going on? You not coming to the meeting? Well, why not? That's superstitious nonsense. So he's at least clearly committed.
He then played up the misogyny angle and said that if it got out that he was canceling Senate meetings on account of his wife's bad dreams, a lot of senators would take it as a deliberate insult.
Come on, bro.
After a pause, Decimus was like, I'm not supposed to tell you this, and then revealed that certain senators had been working behind the scenes on a bill that would allow Caesar to use the title of king so long as he was outside Italy. Decimus continued, saying that the bill was not universally supported, and so if Caesar insulted the Senate
Dude, Decimus, he's tricky, man. He is tricky.
now, it might never see the light of day. This was a bold-faced lie. The bill did not exist. Decimus made it all up.
Hey, just as much as assassination plans can spontaneously start to fall apart, if you have a player in the plan who is spontaneous like this and is able to act on the spot, you can put it back together, or you can sort out another plan. We haven't really heard much about Decimus before this, but clearly he is a pretty talented and tricky individual. He's pretty smart. And like we've said, pretty bold-faced. I mean, he clearly believes in what he's doing because he is going full on the, basically lying right to Caesar's face, willing to spend time with the man who he wants to murder.
But the lie flattered Caesar's ego, and so it was super effective. He agreed to go to the Senate meeting. Decimus's quick thinking had just saved the conspiracy.
Jesus.
On their way, a guy named Artemidorus pushed through the crowd, grabbed Caesar, and put a scroll in his hand. He told him, Caesar, read this quickly, and read it alone. It concerns you, personally.
My goodness.
Caesar was constantly getting approached on the street like this, and so he handed the scroll off to one of his attendants and continued on his way. Later investigations would reveal that this scroll contained detailed information about the conspiracy. Caesar would never read it.
So this is something that seems somewhat unlikely, but I would say for this particular instance, you have to remember, there were like 60 people involved in this plot. Clearly word was getting out through Spurinna, and I imagine it was probably leaking out through other people as well. So I don't think it's entirely unrealistic that someone would get access to this type of information.
Now, I mentioned before that the Senate couldn't meet at their normal Senate house, and that for the time being, they were ping-ponging around the city to a bunch of temporary locations. As dumb luck would have it, today's Senate meeting would be happening in a place called the Theater of Pompey, outside of Rome's Pomerium.
Wow.
The Theater of Pompey was actually an entire complex of buildings that had been financed and built by Pompey at the height of his power.
I mean, that is somewhat ironic, but also, as we've seen, this assassination plot has just as many ex-Pompeians as it does ex-Caesarians. So, at this point, sure, it's ironic, but this is not a Pompeian plot against Caesar. This is bigger than that.
Included a theater, an arena, a temple, a place for shopping, all sorts of amenities. Super fancy. Early in the day, the Senate meeting would be taking place in the temple, and later in the day, there would be some kind of gladiator thing in the arena next door. Wait a second. Gladiators. Decimus had gladiators. Apparently, when Decimus learned the location of the Senate meeting, he tried to get his gladiators signed up for the games next door. For whatever reason, they were rejected. So instead, their plan was to just loiter outside the arena as if they belonged there, with their weapons, in broad daylight. Not exactly subtle.
Not subtle, but, there is also the idea that if you look like you belong somewhere, people won't ask you questions. The whole idea that, if you put on a vest and a hard hat and walk around a construction site, no one's going to ask you, what are you doing here? Because you look like you belong. So, that line of reasoning does make some sense.
In case anybody asked, they had an elaborate cover story prepared about how they were waiting to see if another gladiator showed up so that they could arrest him for violating a contract. Anyways, Caesar and Decimus were extremely late to the Senate meeting, so most of the senators were just hanging around outside the temple, making small talk.
Oh man.
But not Cassius. He was all alone, inside the temple, looking up at a larger-than-life statue of Pompey in complete silence. After Pompey's death, Cassius had been one of the few who proved his loyalty by refusing to take up arms against his fellow Pompeians.
Yeah.
What was he thinking here?
Man, I don't know, but it is interesting to think about. An ex-Pompeian who switched sides and sort of recused himself from the war. He's got to have some mixed feelings, right? Maybe he feels like this is him finally coming back to his roots, coming back to his principles, and doing what he thinks is right. Maybe he's conflicted. Maybe he doesn't quite know what to do. It's worth keeping in mind that these are all real people. I know that sounds silly to say, but, this is a whole historical drama with some of the great figures of Roman history, but these are all people, right? They have thoughts, feelings, emotions, they're conflicted, they're mixed up, right? And so it is sort of interesting just to think about the individual people involved in all of this. We had to look at someone like Decimus, and, we don't know what any of these guys are thinking or feeling. We can only guess. Seems like Decimus is a clever guy who is very devoted to the plan and is really willing to go to any end to achieve it. We don't really know what Cassius is thinking, but it's worth keeping in mind that these guys all have different thoughts and emotions rushing through their head right now.
Commotion outside indicated that Caesar was approaching, so Cassius snapped out of it and went outside to greet him. Looking around, Cassius would have been able to see a lot of his fellow conspirators in the crowd. Cassius hadn't seen Decimus for several hours, so he pulled up beside him and Casca, another conspirator, just to make sure everything was all right. A mob of senators each wanted a private word with Caesar, so they would have to wait a while before they could head inside. As Cassius and Decimus and Casca were waiting, some rando senator named Linus approached them and said way too loudly, "Casca, Brutus told me your little secret. How dare you keep me in the dark like this?"
Uh-oh.
Casca panicked. The dude continued, "I hear you're running for Edile. When did this happen?" As
man.
Linus was making a scene,
Just pure comedy.
another rando senator, somebody from outside the conspiracy, pulled Cassius and Decimus aside. In hushed tones, he told them, "I hope that you accomplish your task. Please do not delay. People know, and they are talking."
Yeah, we've had several signs at this point that information has leaked from the pretty big group of senators who were planning this. And now we're getting randoms left and right talking about this, so clearly people know. And they're not really keeping quiet about it.
Cassius and Decimus were stunned by this. They looked towards Caesar, but everything appeared normal.
And we talk about the emotions they're going through. Imagine, by the way, how nervous you would be after hearing that. Caesar is surrounded by a crowd of senators. Any one of them could talk to Caesar and tell him, hey, there's a plot against your life. You need to leave right now. I mean, there is a risk with every single senator who talks to him. So this plan is really shaky at this point.
At that moment, that loudmouth Linus made his way over to Caesar, pulled him aside, and made a big show of whispering something in his ear.
Okay, this guy's a total attention hog. I mean, you can tell he just wants to get himself involved for whatever reason.
Cassius and Decimus and Casca watched with their hearts in their throats. Maybe they should just do it now. Maybe Decimus should get his gladiators. But it was nothing. Linus walked away, and everybody started making their way inside.
Ooh.
On cue, the conspirator Trebonius pulled Mark Antony aside for a private word. Caesar entered the temple and took a seat in his special golden chair/throne.
Yeah, his special golden chair, which, by the way, was definitely not a throne.
As this was a Senate meeting, his bodyguards remained outside. Under normal circumstances, Antony would be sitting only a few paces away, but for the moment he was still outside with Trebonius. This particular Senate meeting was pretty poorly attended. Of the 900 or so potential attendees, only 200 to 300 actually showed up. Of this 200 to 300, 60 were in the conspiracy.
Yeah, that's a pretty high percentage. I mean, to be fair, most Senate meetings seem, like they're not attended very much, but I'm sure having meetings in random temples across the city probably didn't help with the low turnout for these meetings.
That's what, 20 to 30%? Massive. It's no wonder that people were talking.
Oh yeah.
A signal was given, and a bunch of conspirators rose to their feet and moved towards Caesar. Tillius Cimber loudly asked Caesar to consider pardoning his brother, an ex-Pompeian who had fled after the Civil War. As Cimber made his appeal, the rest of the conspirators slowly fanned out and formed a perimeter. Still seated, Caesar answered Cimber, saying that his brother had shown no contrition or remorse whatsoever, and so, no, he wouldn't be pardoning him anytime soon.
Oh man.
By the time Caesar was done speaking, Casca was standing directly behind him.
And here we get to the very famous scene that I think a lot of us have heard about. Once again, very much popularized by Shakespeare's play on Julius Caesar. Yeah, this is probably one of the more famous scenes from world history, or at least Western history.
Suddenly, Cimber reached out and grabbed Caesar's toga, yanking it hard, exposing his bare shoulder. This was the predetermined signal to attack. Casca immediately drew his dagger and stabbed down as hard as he could. He missed. The dagger grazed Caesar's shoulder and drew a bit of blood. Caesar grappled with Casca, shouting, "Casca, what are you doing?" Another version has Caesar shouting, "This is violence." A quick reminder that Caesar and Casca had known each other since childhood.
Oh yeah, a lot of these guys know each other. Some are friends, some are childhood friends.
Conspirator and non-conspirator alike were frozen in shock. Caesar and Casca were engaged in a little tug of war, but nobody moved to help either one of them. For several long moments, nothing happened.
I mean, this is the time when action happens, and you see which direction this is going to go. I mean, sure, there's been all this planning and plotting and discussion, but there's a chance that when we actually get to the assassination, Casca goes in for it, and everybody else gets cold feet. And they stand back, and Caesar manages to defeat Casca. There is a chance here that they all don't go through with the assassination. They can't bring themselves to do it, even after all that plotting. But after that moment of inaction, we all know what actually does happen.
Casca finally called out in Greek, "Brother, help me!" Casca's brother Titidius sprang forward, which broke the spell.
Right. And so Titidius honestly, at that point, probably sprung forward not out of principle or his desire to kill Caesar, but his desire to save his brother. And so, in the end, that is what sent everybody into motion. Wasn't even really about the whole plot that was going on. People were standing there, unsure of whether to go through with it. But Casca calls out to his brother because he actually needs help. And after that, once one person goes, everybody goes.
Suddenly, the room was a flurry of activity. Caesar was able to rise to his feet and get free of Casca. The first person he saw was Cassius, who drew his blade and slashed Caesar in the face. Caesar backed away, right into Casca's brother Titidius, who stabbed him between the ribs. Two non-conspirators rushed forward to help Caesar, but the conspirators forming the perimeter held them back. The rest of the
I mean, if you're gonna do an assassination like this, yeah, you're gonna need 60 conspirators. I mean, this is a large group of men. They can perform actual, like, military action. They're forming a perimeter. They're defending the other conspirators. This is the one benefit of having so many guys involved.
Conspirators pushed in, attacking wildly. Decimus delivered a nasty wound to Caesar's thigh. Cassius then struck for a second time, but amid all the pushing and shoving, his dagger was deflected, and he ended up hitting Brutus with friendly fire, stabbing him in the hand. Eventually, Caesar's leg wound got the better of him, and he fell to the ground. Brutus came forward, hand still dripping with blood, and hunched down over the dictator. Caesar spoke in Greek. "You too, my child?" Brutus stabbed Caesar between the legs.
Extremely famous line of history right there.
Those were Caesar's last words. He pulled his toga up over his face to preserve his last shred of dignity, and he died.
Damn. And I mean, I do think this is one of the reasons why, you know, Brutus has become such a famous figure in this conflict, is that final scene, you know, the what is it, Et tu, Brute, even you, Brutus, or even you, my child, you know, Caesar directly says that to him. It's a very cinematic way to go, and it emphasizes the relationship that a lot of these guys, but in particular Brutus and Caesar, had with each other, and now he's a part of this assassination plot. I mean, it very much is the stuff of movies. It's the stuff of theatrical shows, as Shakespeare showed us.
Coincidentally, Caesar's body had come to rest directly underneath the statue of Pompey. Now that the deed was done, many of the conspirators suddenly found their courage and took turns stabbing Caesar's corpse.
Yeah, so that, I mean, he says found their courage, but I mean, that is blatantly cowardly. You know what, you can't really have much respect for that. Whether you like Caesar or you don't like him, the guys who actually went for it and committed the assassination, I mean, I guess you can say, hey, at least they were committed. The guys who stand around and go in for stabs afterwards, I don't really have much respect for that.
They would be part of the assassination, if only symbolically. Even with this bit of post-mortem stabbing, Caesar only sustained a total of 23 wounds. That means that the vast majority of the conspirators just stood around and watched the assassination.
Wow.
In fact,
and I mean, that does make sense because they had to guard the scene, but that also shows you that, like I said earlier, there was a chance that no one, apart from Casca, would muster the courage to spring forth and actually do it. Because overall, only 23 total wounds were inflicted. So, like he said, most of the people didn't even do anything. So there absolutely was a chance that they would not find the courage or the conviction to go through with it.
In fact, using the ancient sources, we can confidently track 5 of Caesar's wounds. Number 1, from Casca to the shoulder. Number 2, from Cassius to the face. Number 3, from Casca's brother Titidius, between the ribs. Number 4, from Decimus to the thigh. And number 5, from Brutus to the groin. It's very possible that these 5 people were the only ones who struck Caesar while he was still alive.
Look at that. And and these are some of the main characters we've been talking about this whole time, apart from Titidius, who we hadn't really heard about until the end. So it's sort of fitting. I mean, that's how the story has been constructed. But once again, of those 60 people who were involved, it really doesn't take many to do the job. But if those few had refused to get involved, it also doesn't take many to completely ruin the plan and have it fall apart. You know, sometimes, yeah, I think history turns on wide historical trends, but sometimes it can turn on just a few individuals. And this is probably one of those times.
The remaining 18 stabbings may all have been post-mortem. Earlier, I said that the conspiracy was arguably too large, but maybe I was wrong. When the big moment came, as many as 90% of the conspirators did nothing.
I mean, it's not about how large or small it was, it's about who actually had the conviction to go through with it. Doesn't matter how many people you have. If you have 60 conspirators, but none of them have that conviction, then nothing's going to happen. If you have 2 conspirators, but both of them have the courage and the conviction to do what they're going to do, then it's going to work.
Later examination of Caesar's body revealed that of his 23 wounds, 22 were superficial, and only 1 was fatal.
Wow.
The fatal wound was stabbing number 3, the shot between the ribs, delivered by Casca's brother Titidius.
It's unsurprising.
The assassination was over in like a minute. Many senators never even got a chance to leave their seats. Silence filled the room. Marcus Brutus, his hands covered in blood, both Caesar's and his own, was the first to move. He approached the seated senators, pointed to one senator in particular, and shouted, "Congratulations, Cicero, you've regained your liberty."
Jeez. I feel like Cicero might have felt that was in somewhat bad taste. Wow. First off, apologies for getting so dark. It's not even that late, but I don't know about you guys. Where I'm at, it's starting to get dark super, super early, so it's just what it is. So there you go. Caesar is gone. It's a monumental event. Whatever you think about Caesar, I know he's been a controversial figure throughout history. He has his fans and he has his detractors up until today, but you have to admit, he was an immensely important figure in Roman and world history. And honestly, at the point of his assassination, it was not even clear yet how important he would come to be. I mean, he has laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire. Of course, the conspirators wanted to avoid that exact thing. They saw him laying the groundwork for his empire, and they wanted to stop that by killing him. They have failed, as we will see in the future, and some of Historia Civilis' future videos deal with this. The Roman Empire will very much continue, just without Caesar. Although we will have some years of chaos, and we don't quite know which direction things are going to go. So I'm excited to get into that. Next time we have Caesar's funeral, so we haven't quite ended the story of Julius Caesar yet. We basically have, but not quite yet. So yeah, that was a fantastic video. If you guys enjoyed it, I would very much appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships for exclusive reaction content. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.